In 1934, one of the most wanted criminals in America sat down and wrote a fan letter. It was addressed to Henry Ford. The writer praised Ford's V8 as a dandy car, said he drove one every chance he got, even when the law was chasing him. 6 weeks later, that man was shot to death by 6 lawmen on a Louisiana back road. He was sitting in a stolen Ford V8 when they killed him. His name was Clyde Barrow. The engine he died in was flawed the day it launched. Engineers called it obsolete. It overheated, it drank oil, and it cooked its own coolant from the inside out. And yet that same engine created an entire American subculture, built a speed parts industry from nothing, put teenagers past 150 miles an hour on dry lake beds, and became so completely unbeatable at racetracks across the country that promoters and rulebook writers spent a decade trying to figure out how to get rid of it. They couldn't outrun it, so they outlawed it. This is the story of the Ford Flathead V8. How a stubborn old man's billion-dollar gamble became the engine America couldn't stop loving, and racing couldn't afford to allow. So, here's the setup. It's 1929, and Henry Ford has a problem. For nearly 20 years, the Model T had made him the most famous industrialist on Earth, 15 million cars. Then, the market moved on, and Ford was slow to follow. The A, launched in 1927, was a solid car, but Chevrolet was about to hit back with something Ford couldn't answer, a smooth, modern 6-cylinder engine marketed with a slogan aimed directly at Dearborn, a 6 for the price of a 4. The logical response was obvious: build a 6. Every engineer at Ford knew it, every accountant knew it, the entire industry expected it. Henry Ford refused. He had built a 6-cylinder once, back in 1906, and the car flopped. The old man never forgot a failure, and never forgave one. According to multiple accounts from men who worked with him, his position was blunt. He had no use for an engine with more cylinders than a cow has teats, unless it was something nobody else could build. And that was the key. Henry Ford didn't want to match Chevrolet, he wanted to embarrass them. He wanted a V8. 8 cylinders, the configuration of Cadillacs and Lincolns, engines built in small numbers at luxury prices, and he wanted to sell it to farmers and factory workers for the price of a Chevy 6. Every V8 on the market was expensive for one reason. The engine was built as multiple castings, separate cylinder blocks bolted to a crankcase, machined and assembled by hand, precision work, luxury car work. The industry consensus was unanimous. You could not cast a V8 engine block as a single piece of iron. The metallurgy wouldn't hold, the cores would shift, the scrap rate would bankrupt you. Henry Ford was 66 years old, and he decided the entire industry was wrong. Here's where the story gets strange. Ford didn't hand this project to his engineering department. He didn't trust his engineering department. He didn't trust engineering departments in general. Committees, he believed, produced compromises. Instead, in 1930, he took a handful of men and hid them. The location he chose tells you everything about how the old man's mind worked. In Greenfield Village, his open-air history museum in Dearborn, Ford had reconstructed the laboratory of his personal hero, Thomas Edison, brick by brick. And inside that shrine to American invention, behind locked doors, 2 young engineers named Carl Schultz and Ray Laird began designing a V8 in secret with Emil Zollnerlein working out the ignition system. Direct orders from Henry himself and a standing instruction: tell no one. Not the board, not the sales department. For a while, reportedly, not even senior management knew the full scope of what was happening inside Edison's old lab. The design brief was brutal in its simplicity. 1 casting. The entire block, 8 cylinders, crankcase, everything poured as a single piece of gray iron. No bolted-together assemblies, no hand-fitting, a V8 that could be mass-produced like a Model T 4-banger. The engineers hit problem after problem, and one of their solutions would haunt this engine for its entire 21-year life. In a flathead design, the valves sit in the block beside the cylinders, not above them. That kept the engine short, simple, and cheap, but it created a routing nightmare. The exhaust from the center cylinders had to travel through the block, through passages cast inside the iron, right past the coolant, before exiting. 3 exhaust pipes per side, serving 8 cylinders. Think about what that means. Every minute the engine ran, it was pumping exhaust heat directly into its own cooling system. At 40 miles an hour on a country road, fine. At full throttle for extended periods, the Flathead was slowly boiling itself. The engineers knew it. The timeline didn't care. Because Henry Ford had made a decision that, depending on which historian you ask, was either visionary or insane. This was 1930 and 1931, the bottom of the Great Depression. Banks were failing by the hundreds, industrial production had collapsed, and Ford committed somewhere between $50 and $300 million. Accounts vary on the total, but in today's money, you're talking $1 billion or more, to retool his factories around an engine the industry said could not be manufactured. If the casting problem couldn't be solved at scale, the Ford Motor Company might not survive it. On March 31, 1932, the new Ford Model 18 went on sale. Under the hood, 221 cubic inches, 65 horsepower, the world's first mass-produced monobloc V8. Price of entry, around $460 for a roadster. Let me put that number in context. 65 horsepower doesn't sound like much today. In 1932, the average family car made half that. Ford had just sold the performance of a near-luxury car for the price of the cheapest transportation on the market. Crowds mobbed the dealerships just to look at it. Then the engines started coming back. The early Flatheads were a mess. Pistons cracked, oil consumption was so bad some owners joked about filling the oil and checking the gas. Blocks came out of the foundry warped or porous. Early scrap rates in the casting plant were reportedly catastrophic, with some accounts putting rejects at half of everything poured. And the overheating, that original sin baked into the block itself, showed up everywhere the engine was worked hard. A modern car company would have been destroyed by the recall. Ford survived for 2 reasons. First, the foundrymen gradually solved the casting. By 1933 and 34, scrap rates fell, the bugs were engineered out, and horsepower climbed to 75, then 85. Second, and more importantly, none of the flaws mattered to the people buying it, because nothing else on earth gave a working man that much speed for that little money. Not even close. Which brings us back to Clyde Barrow. The letter arrived at Dearborn in April of 1934, praising the V8's speed and its ability to stay out of trouble, a phrase that reads very differently when the writer is being hunted across 5 states. Whether every word is authentically Clyde's has been debated by historians, but the letter itself sits in the collection at the Henry Ford today, and the FBI case files back up the pattern. Barrow stole Ford V8s almost exclusively. They were the fastest thing a criminal could acquire in a parking lot. On May 23, 1934, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were ambushed near Gibbsland, Louisiana. The car they died in, a stolen 1934 Ford V8, hit by over 100 rounds, became one of the most photographed automobiles in American history. You could not buy advertising like that, and Ford didn't have to. Getaway drivers wanted Flatheads. Moonshine runners in the Carolinas and Georgia wanted Flatheads. And hold that thought about the moonshiners because they're going to matter enormously in about 10 years. The Ford V8 had become something no accountant planned, the fast car of the common man, with just enough outlaw in its blood to make it interesting. Ford's first official trip to big league racing, though, was a humiliation. In 1935, promoter Preston Tucker, yes, that Preston Tucker, the man who'd later build the Tucker 48, convinced Edsel Ford to bankroll a team of Indianapolis 500 cars built around the Flathead, engineered with the legendary Harry Miller. 10 Miller Ford Specials were entered. The engines were hopped up to around 150 horsepower with 4 carburetors. The project was rushed, and it showed. Only 4 cars qualified, and every single one retired with the same absurd failure. The steering gearbox had been mounted inches from the exhaust manifold. The heat cooked the grease, the steering seized, and one by one the Fords steered themselves out of the race. Not one finished. Henry Ford, embarrassed on the biggest stage in American motorsport, pulled the plug on factory racing. But here's the thing about the Flathead. The factory never needed to race it. America was about to do that for free. In 1937, Ford introduced a smaller version of the Flathead, 136 cubic inches, 60 horsepower, designed mainly for European tax laws. In America, the V8 60 was a sales flop, too small, too slow for a full-size car. And then, midget racing found it. Midget racing in the late 1930s was the most popular short-track sport in America. Tiny open-wheel cars, packed fairground bull rings, races under the lights. And it was ruled by one engine, the Offenhauser. The Offie was a purebred, twin-cam racing engine, a jewel of machinery that would go on to win the Indianapolis 500 27 times. It was also priced like a jewel, far beyond any working man's reach. The V8 60 changed the math. A junkyard Ford engine, plus aftermarket heads and a pair of Stromberg carburetors, and suddenly an ordinary guy could go midget racing. They called it the poor man's Offie, and it broke the Offenhauser's monopoly on the sport, not by being better, an Offie would beat it heads up, but by being everywhere. And this is where the outlawing begins. Quietly, at first. Because promoters and racing clubs now faced a problem with two bad answers. Let the cheap Fords race the expensive Offies, and the Offie owners, the stars, the big investments, get swamped by sheer numbers. Keep the Fords out, and you turn away half your field and most of your grassroots. So across the country, the rulebooks split. Offie classes here, Ford classes there. Some clubs ran the V8 60 as a separate show entirely. Some Offie organizations simply wouldn't let the Fords in the headline events. No two rulebooks agreed on the details, but they all agreed on the target. For the first time, and not the last, American racing was writing rules about one specific engine, the cheap one, the one everybody had. Then the world caught fire, and for 4 years, nobody raced anything. Ford spent the war building B-24 bombers at Willow Run and tank engines for the Army. And the Flathead did its service too, in trucks, in staff cars, in tens of thousands of vehicles that taught an entire generation of young American men how engines worked, because keeping machinery alive was suddenly a matter of survival. In 1945, those men came home. They were 22 years old, trained as mechanics and machinists and aircraft fitters, flush with back pay and bored out of their minds. And waiting for them in every junkyard in America were 15 years' worth of Ford Flathead V8s, millions of them, for the price of a decent dinner. What happened next was a chemical reaction. Out in the Mojave Desert, on ancient dry lake beds like El Mirage, Southern California kids had been racing stripped-down Fords since before the war. The Southern California Timing Association had been organizing it since 1937. After the war, it exploded. Every weekend, hundreds of home-built roadsters and streamliners lined up on the baked mud to run flat out through the timing traps. And an entire industry grew up around one engine. Vic Edelbrock, Ed Iskandarian, Barney Navarro, Wyand, Eddie Meyer, Harman and Collins. These weren't corporations. They were machinists in rented shops, grinding camshafts and casting aluminum high-compression heads and multi-carburetor manifolds for the Ford Flathead. The American speed parts industry, the aftermarket that today is worth tens of billions of dollars, was born almost entirely as a support system for this one engine. The tricks became a shared national language. Bore it and stroke it, drop a 4-inch Mercury crank in and build the fabled 3/8 by 3/8, relieve the block, port and polish those tortured exhaust passages, stack 2, 3, 4 Stromberg 97s on an Edelbrock manifold. A junkyard engine that left the factory with 85 horsepower could be built in a home garage into a 200 horsepower screamer. And the speeds became genuinely unhinged. In 1948 and 49, hot rodders were dropping flathead-powered cars built from surplus aircraft belly tanks, literal fuel tanks off P-38 fighters, and running them close to 200 miles an hour on the dirt. When the SCTA opened up the Bonneville Salt Flats in 1949, the SoCal Speed Shop Streamliner pushed a Mercury Flathead past 210, unsupercharged, on an engine block designed before most of the drivers were born. Now, quick pause. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We open files like this every week, engines that were banned, killed, or buried by the companies that built them. Okay, because now we get to the part the title promised. By the late 1940s, the Flathead didn't just dominate American grassroots racing, the Flathead was American grassroots racing. And that was precisely the problem. Start in the Southeast. Those moonshine runners we mentioned, their war-sharpened trade had evolved into organized stock car racing, and in 1948, Bill France's brand-new organization, NASCAR, ran its first full season. 52 races, all in the modified division. The championship went to Red Byron, driving a 1939 Ford Flathead coupe owned by Atlanta bootlegging kingpin Raymond Parks and built by the wizard mechanic Red Vogt, the man often credited with coining the name NASCAR itself. Look down the winners' lists from that season and it's Fords, Fords, Fords. Hopped-up flatheads, tuned with a decade of whiskey running knowledge, mopping the floor with everything else on dirt. A field where one engine wins almost everything is a field with a problem. Fans get bored, rival owners quit. So in 1949, France made his move, a new headline division called Strictly Stock, showroom cars only, no modifications. On paper, it was about fan appeal, letting people race what they drove. In practice, it conveniently pulled the spotlight away from a modified division that had become a Flathead Ford benefit show. And Strictly Stock's very first race told you how deep the Flathead culture ran. Charlotte, June 19, 1949. The checkered flag fell on a 1947 Ford driven by Glenn Dunaway. Hours later, Dunaway was disqualified. Inspectors found his rear springs spread in the classic moonshiner fashion, a whiskey car trick baked so deep into Ford culture that the car's owner had apparently forgotten it wasn't legal. The first winner in the history of what became NASCAR's Cup Series was a Flathead Ford, thrown out for bootlegger engineering. Now go west and go local, because this is where the outlawing got explicit. At hundreds of jalopy tracks, roadster ovals, and hardtop bull rings across America, promoters in the late 1940s and early 1950s were staring at entry lists that were 90% hot Flathead Fords, with a handful of brave Chevy and Plymouth Sixes getting lapped for their trouble. And one by one, the rulebooks turned on the dominant engine. Carburetor limits, one carb, stock manifold, written to strangle the multi-carb setups, claiming rules where any competitor could buy a winner's engine for a fixed low price, designed specifically to make it suicidal to bring an expensive full-race flathead, entire economy classes that banned V8s outright and mandated 6s and 4s, which, in America of 1950, was functionally a one-sentence law: no Flathead Fords. And when Zora Arkus Duntov, a Belgian-born engineer who'd later become the father of the Corvette, developed his beautiful Ardun overhead valve conversion heads in 1947, finally curing the Flathead's exhaust heat curse and unlocking enormous power, plenty of roadster and stock classes responded by banning overhead conversions altogether. The one fix for the engine's original sin was in many places against the rules. Now, let's be honest about the framing, because somebody in the comments is already typing. No national sanctioning body ever held a press conference and stamped "banned" across the Flathead, the way NASCAR later would with Ford's 427 Cammer. That's not how grassroots racing kills an engine. It kills it the way it actually happened. One carburetor rule, one claiming rule, one class split, one no V8s clause at a time in dozens of rulebooks, all aimed at the same target. Call it a ban or call it containment, the effect was identical. The Flathead had become so cheap, so tunable, and so utterly everywhere that fair competition against it was impossible, and the sport legislated accordingly. Racing doesn't do that to ordinary engines. It only does that to engines that win too much.
In the end, though, the rulebooks didn't kill the Flathead. Detroit did. The first shot came in 1949 when Oldsmobile released the Rocket 88, a modern overhead valve, high-compression V8 that made the Flathead's architecture look like what it was, a 1932 design. Cadillac launched its own OHV V8 the same year. Then, in 1951, came the Hammer, Chrysler's Firepower V8 with hemispherical combustion chambers, the first Hemi. making 180 horsepower straight off the showroom floor. Numbers of Flathead needed serious surgery to touch. At the drag strips organized by the brand-new NHRA and at Bonneville, the writing appeared on the wall in lap times. The overhead valve engines had more airflow, more compression headroom, more everything. The junkyard price advantage that had made the Flathead king would soon belong to used Olds in Cadillac and, after 1955, small block Chevy engines. Ford itself delivered the formal execution. In 1954, after 21 years and millions upon millions of engines, the American Flathead V8 was replaced by the modern overhead valve Y-block. Dearborn moved on and never looked back. The engine refused to die on schedule, of course. Ford of France kept building flatheads for Simca cars and military trucks for decades. The last ones weren't assembled until around 1990. Somewhere, a French army truck was running Henry Ford's 1932 Gamble while the Berlin Wall was coming down. Think about the full arc of this thing. An engine that every expert said could not be manufactured, built in secret, inside a replica of Edison's laboratory, on the personal stubbornness of a man in his 60s betting his company during the worst depression in history. An engine born flawed, boiling itself from the inside, that succeeded anyway because it handed speed to people who had never been allowed to afford it. Outlaws loved it. Bootleggers perfected it. A generation of veterans turned it into a culture, an industry, and a record book. And American racing, from fairground midget ovals to the birth of NASCAR, became so thoroughly conquered by it that the sport spent years writing rules whose real purpose was to make the Flathead beatable, and finally, just to make it go away. They never banned it for being bad. They contained it for being unbeatable by the only measure that matters at a dirt track on a Saturday night. Everybody has one. Everybody can fix one, and yours is faster than whatever else showed up. And here's the last irony. The engines that killed it, the Rocket, the Hemi, the small block Chevy, every one of them was built by companies that had watched for 20 years what happens when you give ordinary Americans a cheap V8. The Flathead didn't just lose to the modern V8 era, it taught Detroit that the modern V8 era would sell. Today, a Flathead is worth more dead than it ever was alive. Clean early blocks, the 59AB and 8BA castings, real Arden heads, collectors pay startling money for iron that once sat in junkyard mud at $15 a copy. Hot rodders still build them, still argue about relieving blocks and Stromberg jetting, still chase that sound, because a Flathead at full song makes a flat, urgent howl that no overhead valve engine has ever quite reproduced. 21 years in production, millions built. The engine that put America on wheels, put hot rodding on the map, put NASCAR in business, and got itself legislated off half the racetracks in the country for the crime of being too good at being cheap. And there you have it, the Ford Flathead V8. Born from a grudge against Chevrolet, cast in a lab built to honor Edison, beloved by outlaws, perfected by bootleggers, and the only engine in American history that racing had to outlaw one rulebook at a time. If you ran a Flathead, or your father did, or you spent a summer trying to keep one cool, tell me in the comments, what did you pay for it and what would it be worth now? And if you made it this far, subscribe. We open a new file every week.